We are all imposters, from your kindly grandmother to the person who delivers your mail. I think I've used this quote before, but a professor of mine once said that Halloween is the one time a year that we pretend that the other 364 days of the year we're not wearing a mask. What this quote means to me is that we are always presenting a version of ourselves. And that version is filtered and tailored to the environment we are in and the audience that we currently have. We never present a perfect, unfiltered version of self. And I don't think that this is a malicious act or an act of intentional deception. Instead, I think it's because the idea of self is inherently very messy and complicated. Philosophers have argued exactly what makes up the self, and neuroscientists have tried to understand where in the human body self lives. Some Buddhists even believe in the not self, the idea that in reality there is no thing that is the self. And someday I want to make a video all about self, because I think it's such a fascinating concept and the way that the human mind conceptualizes self. Anyways, I'm getting ahead of myself. But for now, today I'm not making that video. Instead, today, let's take a more practical approach to what the self is, if it even exists. Let's assume that the self is a part of us that has access to our senses and is composed at least of our thoughts and our feelings. And that may be an incomplete list. The self may contain a bunch of things beyond thoughts and feelings, but at least in my own personal conception of self, those two aspects seem very critical. I would not be who I am if not for the thoughts I have and the things that I feel. And conveniently, for the purposes of the point that I'm trying to make, thoughts and feelings are not shareable. I don't have the ability to take a feeling that I am feeling and beam it into your head so that you can experience it in exactly the same way that I do. Instead, I have to make a video and employ the incredibly imperfect language and imagery to try to create a shared understanding of a thought or feeling that I have in you, so that you can understand it, but you still don't have access to the source material. So, mechanically speaking, I would argue that at least two parts of the self are not shareable, and so by extension, the self itself is not shareable. And instead, what the rest of the world has is just an understanding of the self that we create. And I use create here very intentionally, because I think that the process of projecting ourselves into the world is a creative process. The way that we choose to express our thoughts and feelings to the world is not without artistic license. And with that, we circle back to the initial, perhaps controversial statement that I made at the beginning of this video, that is that we are all imposters. And I don't mean it in the overwrought and overt, I put on a stovepipe hat, pretend that I can grow a beard, and claim that I'm Abraham Lincoln, but instead in the sense that the person that we present to the world is not ourself. There is a disconnect between our knowledge of self and the perception in the world that we create. We are always an imposter in the sense that we are presenting only a version of ourself, trying to create potentially an accurate or inaccurate perception in others of who we are. A process that takes place at the conscious level and also at the subconscious level. To ground this in a practical example, freshman year of college, I had a bit of a wardrobe change and I started wearing graphic t-shirts like the one that I'm wearing right now. And no one thought anything of it. All of my co-freshmen in the freshman dorm just thought that's the way that I dressed. And then winter break came around. And all of a sudden, I went home and I saw friends from high school, and they were all shocked at the fact that I wasn't wearing a plain colored t-shirt. Because during all of high school, that is all I wore. And so in that moment, I came to appreciate the divide between me, myself, and the perception and expectations of others in the world. It was an eye-opening experience for me, and I think it created in me a fundamental tenet that I've carried with me ever since, which is that there are certain inflection points in our life when we get to tweak the self that we present to others. And those are often the big change moments. Like, for instance, when I moved to and lived in London, when I went to college, when I moved to California. In all of these moments, I had an opportunity to leave some parts of myself on the cutting room floor and adopt new ones. Sometimes it was wardrobe related, and sometimes it was a new haircut, but it was always an opportunity for me to change the way that I presented myself to the world. But the second and more recent revelation has to do with the dissonance between our perception of self and the world's perception of our self. And that is because there is a great deal of, I think, fear and anxiety that people can feel when those two things are particularly out of whack. And that friction between internal self and external self is popularly referred to as imposter syndrome. And over 15 years working in tech and 6 years working at Google, I've seen my fair share of imposter syndrome. It generally manifests as a belief that the external view of us is unnaturally inflated, that the world sees us as much better than we actually are, and a lot of the good things that are happening to us is because of that, and more importantly, that if people were to realize the truth, were to find out how we really were, instead of how they perceived us to be, that we would lose some of that standing or it would jeopardize us in some way. In big tech in particular, this often takes the form of, look around me, look at all of these incredibly smart people and this incredibly rigorous hiring process. I must have slipped through the cracks. And if anyone ever finds out that I'm not as good as all of my colleagues, then they'll certainly fire me on the spot. And so most people's solution to imposter syndrome is to just lay low and hope that people keep thinking these inaccurate and overly grandiose things about them. This particular solution is a vicious cycle, though, because as you accept the inaccurate views of the world and pretend, fake it till you make it, you just become complicit in that lie. And as you continue to feed that, as you continue to watch that divide between what you think is your reality and what the world perceives is your reality, the consequences become bigger and bigger. The fear of loss, the fear of being an imposter becomes greater and greater, and for a lot of people can really become all-consuming. And I think this grappling with the dissonance of internal self and external self is inherently just a part of being a human. I think we all do it, and only for some does it rise to the level of syndrome. And honestly, my diagnosis for that is that I think it has a lot more to do with environment than anything else. I think there are a great many environments who tie their brand to, say, hiring the smartest people. And by doing that, they create an environment in which everyone feels like they don't live up to the standard that is implicit in that brand. I think of older brands, and they generally valued their products above all else. We make the best vacuum might have been something that Electrolux was quite proud of. But today there's a bit of a cult of personality in tech where you want to be hiring the best talent and you want to be the most exclusive, etc., etc. And it really feeds that mentality of imposter syndrome. And I think that's really unfortunate because while I think we are all imposters, I don't think it is by our choosing or necessarily a bad thing. I think that it is just a innate part of the human experience that we have a sense of self that cannot be shared. And so as a result, what we put out into the world is a endeavor of creativity to try to express that self to others in a way that creates connection. But as an addendum to this video, I'm going to create my first YouTube short. And for those who don't know, a YouTube short is a maximum of 60 seconds. It's generally a vertical video, etc. But I'm going to create one asking Dr. K, who was the inspiration for this video, a question about my own relationship to imposter syndrome. And I will link that in the video description, along with a brilliant interview with a YouTuber whose name is Ethan, where they talked a lot about imposter syndrome. But from one imposter to another, thank you as always for watching. I hope that you have a wonderful rest of your week, and I will see you next week. Bye-bye. Not apotamus. Ponderous.